Elsie McKinstry Fulford is a descendant of both the McKinstrys of neighboring Van Buren Township and the Huston families of Canton. Let's begin with the Hustons. They're one of Canton's oldest and largest families. What stories do you remember being passed down through your mother, Mildred Huston?
My mother Mildred's father was Leon Huston. My mother was the oldest of the family. And Grandpa worked as a carpenter, and when Mother was a little girl, he worked for a man that bought up mills in different parts of the state and even out of state. Grandpa would move his ever-growing brood to the next place, fix it up. When he got it in operating condition, the man would sell it and move Grandpa and Grandma and the family to the next one. At the time my mother was born, when she was the oldest, they lived on Cross Street in Ypsilanti. I believe the house is still there, just as you're going down into Depot Town. In later years, Grandpa farmed on Cherry Hill Road before you get to Ridge on the north side. I can point the house out, but I don't know what the address is. At one time, George Longwish lived there up until I believe he died there. And I can remember Mom and also her brother Lloyd telling about when they were little kids, they used to take the sheep down to the local stream when they knew the sheep shearers were going to be coming. And they would wash the sheep in the creek. It would take a couple of people to hold them and suds them and rinse them off with the running water from the little stream. I don't know whether that stream still exists even or not, but it evidently cut through either a part of their farm or a neighboring farm that they could drive their sheep to. And then that way they'd take the sheep back to the farm and put them in a clean barn, keep clean straw with them until after they were sheared, so the wool brought a little bit more money. I do know that Grandpa farmed when they came back to Cherry Hill. He no longer worked for this man, but Grandpa also, many years ago, I can remember taking Grandfather for a ride out North Territorial Road and having him point out to me barns that he had built when he was a young man and able to do it, where they had to drill the holes with the hand auger machine and peg the barn, put these large wooden pegs to hold these big beams together. And so some of those are still in existence. I don't know whether I could find them anymore or not. There's only one of that family that is still living. My mother's brother still lives in East Jordan. Wish we could get him down for an interview. It might be interesting too.
Yes. Talking about the sheep that your grandfather raised, you had mentioned that your father raised hogs. Tell me a little bit about that.
When I was a child, we raised, we'd keep an old sow and have her bred so that we would have the little pigs from it. Sell some of them off as small piglets to somebody else that wanted to raise some pork. Dad would keep 4, maybe 5 that he would raise himself to market size, and then they would butcher them, sell maybe 2 or 3 to people that had spoke for pork, and the rest we would cut up and use for our own use. As I was saying, it was I remember it seemed like the falls were so much colder then than they are now, especially this year has been so warm. But they would, with a block of tackle, haul the hogs, the carcasses, up into the tree, wrapped in sheets, till they could get to a day or 2 later to cut them up. And the meat would be froze solid when we would bring them back down out of the tree. This, of course, was to keep them from the dogs or whatever might be around. And then cutting up the meat, and Mother would try out the lard. We had a small porch that was enclosed in the wintertime off the kitchen, and in that the meat had been stored that had been salted down and then smoked, so that we always had our own bacon, our own hams and shoulders. Mother made sausage, head cheese. I can remember Mother even using the meat off of the head and making the head cheese, and also another bread that we used to call crackling bread, which she used the cracklings after the lard was tried out. They ground the pieces of fat, was ground up, then it was tried out in the oven slowly to get the lard was just as white as our Crisco today would be. And that was a really treat, was to get that, to make that like a biscuit, but she made it in a large pan. And I remember she always cut it in diamond shape with a couple of fork prints in the top of each one. That would still be Mom to me if I saw a pan of that. We lived on a very small farm just into Van Buren, right on the corner of Yost and Sheldon Road. And raised chickens. We had a few cows, just more for our own use. They would churn the cream and make butter, which was sold. Plus, we always had all we wanted for ourselves. The extra buttermilk went to feed the pigs. Usually always had one or two that were pets that we could play with when we were kids, too.
What did you feed the hogs?
I remember Dad going to the mill, and I think he used to even take his own wheat, as I've been trying to remember, wheat and corn, and had it ground together. Years ago, there used to be a mill up on Gettysburg, up toward Ann Arbor. I remember going with my father there. You know, as I think of it too, we used to have a grain mill up, or an old grist mill of some sort upstairs in the barn, and they must have ground some grain up there too. I don't remember that part of it as a kid, but I remember that old machinery up there. But that was mixed with hot water or with the buttermilk that was left over. Potato peelings and scraps from the table all went into the feed for the hogs, and didn't have to worry about a garbage disposal. We had them in the backyard.
You had mentioned earlier when we were chatting the way that sausage was stored. What did your mother do to store sausage?
Yeah, mother would grind. They would grind the meat and season it with just sage and salt and pepper, which I still prefer. Packing it in crocks, as I remember, about this big around and probably about that tall, probably maybe about a three quart crocks. Packing the sausage in solidly, and then pouring a layer about 1.5 inches, maybe 2 inches of the hot lard over the top of that. And this porch we had off of the kitchen would keep things very, very cold. There would be ice crystals in there where you just scraped the fat back and dug the sausage out, brought it into the kitchen, let it thaw and make patties on it, and it was delicious.
You had mentioned also the ways in which you used lard then without, because you didn't have butter.
Yeah, it was, you fried your things in lard, you used it to make cookies. Mother made her own bread, so there was lard used in that. Pie crust was always made with lard, which I always did myself up until just a few years ago, when I know we now know it's not good for us.
You attended Sheldon School.
Yes, I did.
Tell me what you remember about Sheldon.
I might mention also my father even attended Sheldon School when he was a little boy. And Dad never went farther than the 8th grade. In fact, I don't even know whether Dad even went all the way through the 8th grade or not. When I went to school there, we had 2 entrance ways that we came into. The boys' entrance was on the left-hand side as you walked up onto the porch, and the girls on the right. There was a large stove that heated the whole building. I remember the entrance ways as you came in, there was like a half wall around, because when you came in from the other part, that's where the stove sat. And but we had room in there to hang our coats, and we had individual toilets, the boys on one side and the girls on the other, with a door going out of those 2 rooms into the large room, which that was the big school, in the big school. I don't know, I can't remember what year, but it was before I got out of there that the school was remodeled, and central heat put in. Evidently, that was when the basement was put under, and water probably put in too. Also, I can remember for drinking water, we just had a bucket and I should say a water pail with a dipper. And you just all went, you wanted to drink, you went and dipped out of it and drank out of the dipper. Probably we're healthier then than we are now.
Children behaved a little bit differently in classes then, didn't
Very
they?
much so. You did not leave your seat without permission. Even to go to the bathroom, you asked for permission. You asked for permission to go up to the bookcase to get a book, which was always a treat for me. I loved to read. All of the classes were conducted up at the front of the school in a semicircle around the teacher. And I think we learned from the other classes sitting in our seats. It always was interesting to me. I actually skipped the 7th grade because I had picked up a lot of the 7th grade stuff when I was in the 6th grade. And when we took our tests at the end of the year, I graded for 8th grade and was put forward. Remember, the only thing I took in the 7th grade class was a geography class, which I still love as geography. And so I think we learned from sitting there at our desks, listening to the other classes, and so on. And you'd always hurry to get your lessons done. I don't remember taking much homework home from grade school. That I don't remember taking things home. I do know I always felt I had an advantage, all of us kids in the family, because our mother had been a teacher at the old Palmer School before she married Dad. And Mother was, our favorite game when we were little kids at home was playing school. Of course, we argued over who was going to be teacher. You know, Mom usually had to settle that. That was a favorite game. So by the time we started school, we knew our ABCs. We could print our name, write our name, do simple reading even, because Mother had made a game of it for us.
She encouraged you to love books too.
Very much. I remember a saying my mother used to say, you can travel anywhere in the world if you can read. And how true it is. I remember it to this day. My mother never traveled very far, but my mother was a very bright woman. I can remember we maybe have something we have to, now what's the capital so-and-so state? She knew it instantly. She could, and she taught it to a lot of us kids, so that was one of our lessons. Write down all the names of the states and then write in the capitals. That was one of the games that we played in our school at home. I hadn't thought about that before in a long time.
There were certain routines in the school every day also, weren't there?
Yes, I remember walking up to school, which was about 3/4 of a mile, up to Sheldon. School bell would ring at about 8:45. Either the teacher or one of the older boys that had come in, there was a long wire that came down through the ceiling with a handle on it, and some of the little kids I can even remember yet jumping to get hold of that. They were too short, to get hold of it. They wanted to, different ones had their turn at ringing the bell. That was also rung at noon to bring us back into classes afterwards. We started our day at school, as I remember, by saying the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. And as I say, the different classes sat I remember they sat at different sides. The 8th grade would be over to the far side, then the 7th, 6th, and 4th. There was only half of the 4th grade, I should say half a day of the 4th grade done in one school and then in the other, because it was getting so many children they couldn't take the whole class over there. So we'd go half a day if you were in the 4th grade to the little school, and the other half, then after lunch you went into the big school to take what other lessons you were getting over there. Probably not more than, I know the year I was in the 8th grade, there were 9 of us in the class, 5 boys and 4 girls. And that was the year that Betty Sutton died. And I remember the 4 boys were her pallbearers and we girls were honorary pallbearers behind her casket. She was buried at the Sheldon Cemetery. That was Sid and Clara Sutton's daughter. She had been ill most of her life, but as I say, we were 8th graders when she died. So in those 5 classes, maybe 40 to 45 kids was probably it, with one teacher. The classes set up at the front, and we had huge blackboards that we did a lot of your lessons. That was another thing you picked up sitting in your seat. You sat there and watched what was going on at the blackboard, and oh, that's right or that's wrong, you know. So you were learning yourself at the same time.
The teacher had a platform also, didn't he
Well,
or she?
Yeah, she had a desk. I had a man teacher all the years I was in the big school. Jack Beadle was my teacher when I first went over there, and then Frank Trott the last 2 years. His desk sat over to the left-hand side, but the very front of the school, all the way across, was raised up 1 step, I believe, only. So that put him up a little bit at an elevation, but yet his desk was to one side. And then there was a blackboard all the way across the front. And always was a picture of Abraham Lincoln and George Washington on the wall, the famous painting that never was finished completely. And as I say, the flag was an important part. And another important part that I remember was just before noon recess. We all got at our desks, and we said our noon grace. God is great, God is good. Let us thank him for this food. By his grace we all are fed. Bless us, Lord, this daily bread.
You also had a library.
The Wayne County Library sent someone out about, I don't remember now whether it was every month or every 6 weeks, and brought in a whole batch of new books, big bundles of them. And that was a real thrilling time, because by that time we'd all read everything that was there. And it was always so interesting to see what new books we were going to get. And that was a real treat. She took away the other ones and brought the new ones. You know, another thing we had when I was a kid too in school, we had a visiting nurse that came. And this visiting nurse would come in, and they tested our eyes, they tested our hearing. Oh boy, when I was a kid, that must have been in the little school, we even had a program where they took us to a dentist. This was Depression years. I was born in 24, so I would have been going into school, 29, 30, some along in there. And they took us to a dentist, which cost our folks a very minimum to go to the dentist. Probably no more than 50 cents, and different parents in the neighborhood that had cars would take us. I can remember going over, we were all excited, coming back, we were all crying because our mouth hurt from going to dentist. I'll never forget one dentist we had many years ago, kind of a red-headed man, and I think he was upset because he wasn't making a lot of money. He was just getting a very small stipend from the county for being a county dentist, and he was so rough with us kids. It was we hated to go after that first trip.
You also had music appreciation.
Yes, I can remember that. I must have been in the probably the 8th grade, and different records were played. We learned the authors, or the composers. We learned the different philharmonic orchestras that was playing the pieces, and of course, I said it always rings true in my mind. Rossini's William Tell Overture, because that was the theme of the Lone Ranger, which we all listened to on the radio every night. But then at the end of, or along towards spring, we were taken as a class down to Detroit to, I can't remember what they called that building now. It was where the Detroit Symphony Orchestra played, I believe Orchestra Hall probably. And I'm not sure of the conductor. I want to say Mr. Kotler, but I'm not sure if that was him now. But that was a big treat, not only to go to that, but even just going into Detroit. was something you didn't do. You didn't travel that far afield. Our world revolved around our school and our local Methodist church, our community.
You mentioned earlier the role of the PTO. Tell me a little bit.
PTA.
Oh, PTA
Yeah.
then, that's
Yeah.
correct.
Yeah, Parent Teachers Association.
Yes.
Yeah, that was a big thing. We met once a month, and the concerns of the school were talked about among the parents. All the women brought probably a Jello and a cake or something like that for refreshments afterwards. As I said, I don't remember too much about what the business meetings were about, because all of us kids were hurrying, hoping they'd get over with quick so we could get to the Jello and cake part. But it was a time for talking over the problems in the church, and in the school, so that could be whatever problems were coming up. And we had a very active school board. Anything that had to be done around the school, all the teacher had to do was call the school board, and it was some of those men that came in and fixed or repaired whatever had to be done.
And the children came to these meetings also?
Oh yes, whole families. You didn't have babysitters in those days. Unless you had somebody old enough in the family to leave your kids at home with, and the kids wouldn't have wanted to miss out on the Jello and cake anyhow. That was a treat.
Mm-hmm.
So no, everybody went. Everybody went. They were very well attended. The school would be packed.
There were various performances at both the school and the church.
We always put on, especially I can remember the Christmas. We always had a big Christmas program. We'd have a play with several of us in it. We'd have different recitations, and we'd have some singing. The neighbors' sheets were brought in to use as curtains for the, strung a wire across, and pinned it to make so you could slide it back and forth. And everybody participated. All the children had a part. None were left out. If it was no more than a cardboard winged angel in the Christmas play, and it was true at church too. And of course, Santa Claus always came and brought a little box of candy for all the kids and that was a great wonderment to all of us kids. I to this day don't know who some of the Santa Clauses were. But church was also the same way. Our Sunday school classes put on, and not only just for Christmas. We had things for Easter. We had a Thanksgiving or like a little harvest program. I especially remember Easter we did it too.
And in that era, there wasn't the separation of the religious from the secular. You had religious programs in school.
That's right.
As well as secular, I would assume.
Yes.
You had mentioned also that kindergarten was called something else.
It was called chart class when I went to school. And it actually, I suppose it derived from the fact that the lessons were on this huge chart, approximately this wide and maybe this long, and it consisted, the whole thing when it was shut back down was probably about this wide. It stood on an easel in front, and of course we went up for our class and sat there in our little chairs, and on these different pages had different things to learn. I also remember the teacher having flashcards, which I understand are still used, but these were not just to learn your ABCs. We learned phonetics, and that is the way I never could understand how kids learn to read without phonetics, because to this day I can sound a word out because I know what a letter sounds like. We didn't learn to say the ABCs just as A, B, C, D, E, F, G. We learned it as abakata, f, g, all the letters that it could be. Then we went back and she would have cards with a long mark above the A. I don't remember what they called all these things, but to tell you the different words and how these letters were used so that you learned the different sounds of the letter A or the letter E. You learned CH could be ch, like in church, or it could be K, like K. I've often heard that the English language is one of the hardest to learn, but I think learning it the way we did, I think could even be used today to some of the people that come here to learn languages. I thought it was great. We learned we had multiplication tables. I understand they don't do that in school anymore either. I don't know how you ever learned to multiply anything if you didn't learn your multiplication tables. But that was did, of course, in the middle school when we were small grades, and of course the chart class was there too. But the multiplication tables, as we were learning them, that building, the east wall was all a blackboard. They were put up there, and as we learned it, it was left there, and then the next one was put up. It would be the 2s, and then the 3s, and 4s, and on up till as we learned them. And we learned them by doing them from the top down, but also the teacher could point to one, and you had to be able to give the answer once you had learned it. It wasn't just that you had to go back in your mind and say, 2 times 2 is 4, 2 times 3 is 6, 2 times 4 is 8, 2 times 5 is 10, you know. You didn't have to bring it up to that point. You learned it, and it stayed there.
The kindergarten class lasted a longer
It was
time
all
than
day.
it does today.
It was an all-day class. When I went to school, we started at 9 o'clock and we got out at 4. We had an hour for lunch and we had 2 15-minute recesses. One at roughly 10:30 and the other one probably about 2:30. We were back in our seats at 1 o'clock. And you didn't go home for school unless you lived next door. I suppose the Simons kids probably went home for lunch. Some of the kids that lived right in Sheldon. I lived 3/4 of a mile away. We brown bagged it.
Tell me the games you played as a child.
Well, I can remember playing jacks. We used to play jacks a lot. It was a favorite game. We played another one anti-eye over the roof with a ball. You chose sides, and maybe there'd be 3 or 4 of you on each side of the building. You threw the ball over. If someone on that side caught it, then they could come around and try to catch you, and you were watching both sides to make sure that they weren't coming. If you missed the ball, you had to pick it up, throw it back over to the other side, and take your chance on getting. Wintertime, it was fox and geese. We did a lot of ice skating and sledding, you know, whatever we had to slide on. I remember one year when I was a child, down near our home, we had had a lot of snow, and then we had a real heavy freezing rain. And that rain the ice was so thick on top of these mounds of snow that we skated all over the fields, right over the tops of the fences and everything. It was wonderful. Now, I suppose an adult would have broke through. Once in a while we'd catch a blade and go through. But that was the best ice skating we ever had. I remember that one winter. But let's see, back to games. Of course, the boys loved baseball. They always played baseball. We never had a basketball hoop. I don't remember anything about a basketball hoop around the school when I was a kid. We had gymnasium bars outdoors that we played on, and of course swings. Not a lot of them. You had to wait, take your turn. But I do remember, you know, like skinning the cat on the parallel bars and stuff, with just the sand underneath if you fell off.
What was that game? Skinning the cat, how did you play it?
Well, you jumped up on your hands like this on the bar. Oh, there again, we had the little bars and the big bars. The little kids could play on the shorter ones, the big kids on the big ones. You kind of hoisted yourself up onto your belly, and then you swung around and flipped your legs through and went off this way backwards. And that was part of the one of the games we played on it, or just one of the exercises, I guess.
What were the rules to fox and geese?
As I can remember, the one that was in the middle, you had a large circle, and the other ones were on the outer perimeter with some cross pieces, making it like a big pie shape. And his idea, if he could catch any of you on one of those paths, you tried to run back and forth and keep him from catching you. If he caught you, then you were in the middle too. And then if I remember right, you had to help him catch others too. So it became a game of a lot of hilarity and fun. It was a fun game.
You had snowball fights in the winter.
Oh, of course.
Snowball fights and angels, you
Yeah.
mentioned.
I can remember we used to another thing we used to do, we had some kind of a game. How the heck did we play that? We had a rubber ball. We bounced it off the back of the school. There was no windows on the back of the school. And you threw the ball up and you caught it. And the next time you threw it up, you threw it under one leg and caught it. And then you threw it under the other leg and caught it. And then you knew it, you threw it over your back and turned around quick and caught it. Until you missed your turn, but I don't know what all the different ones were in the sequence now, but I can remember doing that. And we all carved our initials in the bricks out back there. I'm sure mine are still out there somewhere, unless they've sandblasted it all off.
No, there are
I've
many
always,
initials still.
I've always been going to go look and see if I can find mine. I never could think of it when I was there.
Most kids get into mischief. What mischief did you get into, or your friends?
You know, not at school. I can't remember ever getting into trouble at school because I always remembered my father saying, if you ever get in trouble at school and get sent home, you get a spanking and you get taken back to school. And to my knowledge, my father never laid a hand on me, but I also knew he meant it. And so I didn't do it. We didn't have the things to tempt us, I think, that we had then. I liked to read. My nose was always stuck in a book as a kid. I remember Mom taking my books away and making me go outside to play. But I would rather read. Now I don't find time to, and I'm sorry.
You noticed a lot of changes at the intersection of Sheldon and Michigan Avenue. What did it used to look like?
When I was a little child, where the rec center is now, there was an old country store. Mr. and Mrs. Fry lived upstairs in the store, and they conducted the business down below. And it was a very quaint little old-fashioned store with a wooden porch across the front. Every time I go into the Cracker Barrel, I always think of, in a way, that's kind of like our little store was. Except I don't remember the chairs sitting out there. I think there was a couple of wooden benches that people would sit in and visit. But the store was just a nice, warm place. Mr. and Mrs. Fry were nice people, especially Mrs. Fry. She was just such a sweet lady. The big round of cheese with a cover that you go up and she cut off a chunk of cheese. I can remember Mom sending us to the store for, maybe for 25 cents worth of liver, which was enough to feed our whole family back in those days, or 25 cents worth of cheese to make a big pan of macaroni and cheese for the family. We also were very self-sufficient in those days. We grew a big gardens, so in the fall, Dad would have crates or pails that he would fill with sand, and we would put carrots down in that. We would put beets. The onions were hung up. We always grown potatoes. We had lots of those, and we had a cellar area that we could store that sort of stuff in. Cabbages, plus Mother canned everything she could lay her hands on, fruit or vegetables or anything anybody gave her. We never canned meat that much. We always had, as I say, smoked meat more, augmented by maybe Dad would go squirrel hunting, and we ate fox squirrel. We used to have a lot of those around. My brother and I were talking about it the other night about squirrel dinners. Oysters were very cheap in those days. You could buy a quart of oysters for 50 cents. None of us kids liked it. We liked the soup with the crackers. Dad got all the oysters. He loved them. Or my uncle, when he came out from Detroit, he would sometimes bring, like corned beef or something like that. That was a real treat. Of course, we had the cabbage. Mother would put maybe 30, 40 heads of cabbage down into the pit for the winter. We had our own milk and butter. Mother made homemade bread. You didn't have the variety of food. And even though it was Depression time, I talked to friends of mine that lived in the city during the Depression, and the stories they tell of actually going hungry or maybe just having a slice or two of bread and maybe with a glass of water. They didn't have any milk even. And I think how lucky I was as a kid. I didn't know we were poor because everybody was poor. But if you lived on a farm, you had enough to eat. We always had enough to eat.
And this food was stored, you said, in a pit as opposed to a fruit cellar?
Well, it was like a fruit cellar. It was under a part of our house. The house had like a Doug basement or Michigan basement with a half wall up part way, and this area down under there, it was actually under what would have been the pantry. There was a trap door in the floor. You could go down in there to get things out of it. I don't remember. We never had a root cellar outside that I remember.
What was the best thing about growing up in Canton as a farming community?
I think the closeness of families. You didn't want to get in trouble because everybody knew who you were. It was going to get back to mom and dad. I also think we learned as a community respect for one another's properties. I will always remember old Mr. Fisher on Sheldon Road. That would have been Clarence's father. They had a snow apple tree, and we'd eye those apples going and coming from school, but we also do better than to take any of them. And Mr. Fisher, if he'd be out there maybe doing chores sometimes, and he'd say, now children, the apples are going to be ripe pretty soon. If you let them alone until they get ripe, I will see that you all get some. And he was true to his word. He'd have a big sack of apples for us to take home to Mother. So we had apples. And then Mother would maybe send him up pears. We had 2 or 3 pear trees, which was more than we wanted for our own use. So people exchanged. People looked out for each other. If a neighbor was sick, you took up whatever you had to eat. You fixed something. That spirit I still see alive in the smaller communities. And I guess as far as I'm concerned, I now live in Wayne, and the area I live in has that same closeness, let's say. I have felt it there, and that's what made me feel at home when I moved there. But I've always been glad that I lived in a small community where we knew everybody. You knew who you could go to if you, let's say if you fell down going home and skinned your knee. You could run into Mrs. Simons and she'd clean your knee and bandage it up and send you on home. Or anybody along the way. If you needed help, they were there for you. It's something I'm sorry we have lost in the world. I think we've lost a lot. And I know it had to be because people are so much more mobile now that they have to go where the work is and so on. We lived in an area where very few people, they didn't work away from home. They farmed. When I was a very small child, my father worked at what we called the clay pit down there at Lilly and Van Born Road. And at that time, they dug clay out of there, and I believe that it was used to make bricks. I believe that clay was used to make bricks. When I was a young kid, the walls of that clay pit were probably 15, 20 feet down to the water. And it was a huge area and very tempting. We never were allowed to go there to swim because Dad knew what was in there as it was filling up with water later on after they were no longer digging there. But in the winter, when the ice got solid enough, 2 or 3 of the men from the neighborhood would go out and they'd test the ice. They'd chop a hole and make sure how deep the ice was. There was no current through it. So it was a wonderful place for ice skating. People came from all over to go skating there. That was really a great place to skate. I remember at the West End, there was an area about halfway down that was kind of like a ledge. and everybody'd bring branches and logs and whatever they had. We'd build a huge bonfire there, and you could come up and get warm. You'd go out and skate for a while, and come back, and sit there and get warm, and toast marshmallows or whatever, you know. But it was a growing place for not only our community. People came from all over to skate there. You probably a couple of hundred people down there some nights.
So there must have been a lot of Canton people who went down there?
Oh, sure. I'm sure there was. Because it was as I say, it was a drawing card. It was such a huge area. There could be, summer boys would be playing hockey on one end, and we still had plenty of room to skate on the other end, you know. We weren't in each other's way at all. I don't know whether you've ever been down by it. It's a large body of water down there now. And I really don't know what they are doing. For a long time, they were filling it in with garbage as a refuse dump. And I know they filled a lot of it in, but that would have encompassed a few acres, I would think, 2, maybe 3 acres in its day. My father, when he was a young man, before I can remember it, worked as a motorman on the old DUR also that came through Sheldon. And I remember one time only riding on that with my mother, and evidently we went to Ypsilanti, and I remember being so frightened. I was probably about 4 years old, and I don't know whether I thought she was going to take me somewhere and leave me or what, but I was awful glad we got off at Sheldon and was on our way home, you know. But Dad worked on that for a few years. Somewhere around home there were some pictures of Dad in his motorman's uniform. I believe that time the DUR went out as far as Jackson, out through Grass Lake, out through that way, and ended up, I believe, in Jackson and back. Then they'll turn around and back to Detroit.
And at that point, Michigan Avenue, what was that, paved or not at that point?
You know, I can't say for sure. It was only one road, at least, because I was a very young child when they made it a 2-way road with a boulevard between. And I'm not even sure just which side of the road the railroad track or the streetcar tracks run on, because that was ripped up before I was very old. My only recollection of it is Dad in his uniform, and at one time going with my mother to Ypsilanti. And I don't know what we went up there for or anything, whether we were shopping or what. I also remember as a child the clothing that we wore, the heavy cotton stockings, the leggings in the wintertime. You had a snowsuit of some sort and some boots. If you were lucky enough to have a grandma that knit, you had nice warm mittens that she knit. I had an uncle, my father's brother, his wife had been killed shortly after they were married, and they never had any children. He worked in a foundry in Detroit and lived with his wife's nephew, I believe it was, and his wife, and their 3 little boys. But on the weekend, he always came out to the farm and helped whatever had to be done. He was there, and I know at hog slaughtering time, I think that's when he took vacation to come and help with the slaughtering and with the cutting up of the meat and stuff. And so I suppose for his day, he was fairly well off, because he paid board and room to Dell and Agnes, I know, but he did things for the boys there too. But he also helped my mother out a lot with us kids. And the year I was to start school, he gave my mother $4 to go buy me 4 new dresses for school. I was the richest kid in town as far as I was concerned, to have 4 new dresses at one time. And they each cost $1 a piece. And going to town when I was a child also, even after Dad had a car, we would go to Ypsilanti usually. And downtown Ypsilanti was a very viable place with lots of stores and stuff. And you only got a pair of shoes when you wore your old ones out, when they got too bad to wear. And you didn't do like I do, and I'm a shoeaholic, probably have 35 pair in the closet. I think to myself, how wasteful when I look back at how it was when I was a child. But whichever one Mother was shopping for that day, she took with her, and And Dad stayed in the car, and the rest of us stayed in the car with us. And if we were good, Mom might bring back some candy. We'd have some special candy. I remember the candy that you still see in the store now that looks like the kernels of corn. How you could make one of those last a long time, that just chewed out the little white piece first and savoring that so much, and then you ate the little yellow on the other end. You saved the big piece of orange in the middle for later.
You had mentioned the walk to school in winter.
Yeah, we never had a ride. Rarely did we get a ride to town. It wasn't quite as bad going to school because we had to be fairly presentable when we got there. But on the way back, especially if there was lots of snow, you never walked in the road. You walked up through the ditches and along the fence rows where the snow was clear up to your waist or better, and you're wallowing in it. I can remember Mother saying, "Don't come in the door." And she'd come out with a broom and sweep us off because we'd be so covered with snow. My friend Ann is nodding over there. I think she did the same thing as a kid. Yes, it was, I don't know, we played outside a lot, even when it was really, really cold. I also remember Mom hanging clothes outside when the weather was so cold, and maybe by the time we got home from school, it was time to start bringing them in, and they'd be stiff as a board. You know, you brought them in, you draped them over everything to finish drying. But oh, they were so nice and white, and they smelled so good. Especially remember my dad's long underwear. You could stand him up in the corner, you know. Oh, I can remember wearing the one-piece long underwear when I was a child. I was lucky enough, my grandma, Huston, which was my grandfather's second wife. My mother's mother died the year my mother and dad were getting married. And my mother had quit school. I'm wrong. He remarried the year my mother and dad were going to get married. My own grandmother had died when my mother was, I think, 19, and I think she was 21 when she and Dad got married. So Mother quit teaching and went back home to raise the children because there was a lot of little ones. Mother was the oldest of 6. Floyd was just a baby of probably 3. I'm not sure. I think she died in childbirth along with the child. And it was really hard back in those days. And Grandma, the only Grandma I ever knew, Mother and Dad were going to get married. Grandpa advertised for a housekeeper. My Grandma Huston, Ida, had been married before and had 2 children, and a boy and a girl. And her husband had been killed in cutting a tree down that fell on him, and he was killed as a young man. Left her with these 2 little children. Grandma could make anything, if it was sewable or knittable or crochetable. Grandma could do it. And her daughter, I believe it was living in Detroit at that time, newly married. And let's see, she would have been about my mom's age, I think, and Grandma had come up to visit her. And she saw Grandpa's ad in the paper that he was looking for a housekeeper for these 5 children and so on. And Grandma didn't have anything special to go back to Ohio for, so she answered the ad and took the job. And within the year, Grandpa married her, and they were married almost 50 years before he died. And she was the only Grandma I ever knew. My father's people died when my oldest brother was a little boy. Grandma Huston, I've heard my mother say so many times, I couldn't have loved her more if she was my own blood mother. And she always, when they came to our house, it was pick up a basket of mending and take home. Mildred, you've got enough to do with helping with the chores and with the feeding and washing and stuff of the kids. Let me take the mending home. Just keep putting it in the basket. And there was a little basket of some sort there that Mother would put things in. And Grandma would take it home. She'd take Grandpa's shirts and cut them down and make blouses for us. You know, the front panels and the backs, there was enough good material there. Grandma could sew anything. And strange as it may seem, she liked to make things over better than she did start from scratch. Most people don't like to do that part of it, but Grandma always did. And right up till the time I was married, Grandma was always doing a little mending, or not mending, I should say, alterations. If she had something that didn't fit just right, well, bring it over, bring it over. And I always went over and gave her her permanents and stuff like that, you know. And she was a very, very sweet lady, and she was always very good to us kids. Grandpa was a very stern man. I never felt comfortable climbing on Grandpa's lap. I don't know whether he didn't like kids or what, but maybe we were too grungy or something. But Grandma always, and she ever came without a sack of cookies or, you know, something like that she'd bring over. But my folks never had much of anything besides kids.
Well, you have,
I was going to say, but the one thing that we had was family. And to this day, we're still not in each other's pockets, but we're there for each other when chips are down, when somebody needs help. You just holler, and they're there. And I think that's what family's about.
those are nice memories.
They are.
You have
They
a
are.
lot of nice.
I can remember my mother-in-law, after my husband was gone, Mother and I lived together and we moved into Wayne, and she said so many times how bad she felt that, you know, we could at that point have what we needed or wanted or within reason. And she felt so bad that Floyd couldn't have had these things. And how when he was little, they didn't have much of anything. And I said, Mom, Floyd had what was needed the most. And to start with, he was an only child, so he got all the love and all the attention. He had an adoring aunt in Detroit that sewed, and she never came out that she didn't have some new little clothes that she'd made for Floyd. And as Floyd said, I guess we were poor, but I didn't know it, because everybody else was poor too. And he said, as I look back on it now, they were probably worse off than us, because a lot of them had 5, 6, 7, 8 kids to feed, and Mom and Dad had just the one. But Mother and Dad used to argue when they got married whether they had 4 pigs and $2, or whether it was 2 pigs and $4 to their name when they got married. That was all they had. I think I grew up in the best years. I wonder sometimes what the kids of today are going to have to look back on as memories.